Part 24. The Weapons Pit. The Desert, northwest of Calexico. 12:04 p.m. The land was burning under the sun, like a delirious hallucination. Heat shimmered the image, mirage-like, as the Terminator turned the station wagon off the paved highway and barreled along a roadbed of sand and gravel, trailing a huge plume of dust. They passed a sign that read, Sharon Mesa, 2 miles, and under that, Calexico, 15 miles. Ahead, Sarah saw a pathetic oasis of humanity in the vast wasteland. A couple of aging house trailers, surrounded by assorted junk vehicles and desert-style trash. There was a dirt airstrip behind the trailers, and a stripped Huey helicopter sitting on blocks nearby. Whoever lived here didn't much care for the city life, or the niceties of a planned community, and they probably didn't pay their taxes. The station wagon rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust. "Stay in the car," Sarah commanded as she slowly got out. She could see that somebody was trying to make it look as if no one was home. The door to the nearest trailer banged in the wind. There was no noise, save the lonely keening of the wind through the yucca. Good tactics, she thought, assuming they must have seen the dust cloud coming minutes ago. As she crossed the yard, she noticed a subtle shifting of shadows inside one of the trailers. And perhaps she was just hyped up, but she thought she saw the gleam of something metallic. A weapon, most likely. A small dust devil whirled through the camp, stinging her eyes. Keeping her empty hands held away from her sides, she cautiously approached the trailer, hoping she hadn't miscalculated. For all she knew, her friends had gone off, and the place really was deserted. Or had been taken over by less friendly faces. "Enrique, are you here?" she tried, sounding unnaturally loud in the open desert. Sarah heard a ka-chack behind her and spun, whipping out her .45 tucked behind her back in one rapid motion. In fact, she did it so quickly, the Terminator was a full 2 seconds behind her in lunging out of the truck and whipping up his shotgun. They were aiming at a man who had suddenly popped into view behind the Huey. He was in his mid-40s, a tough Guatemalan with a weathered face and heavy moustache, wearing cowboy boots and a flak vest over a bare, nearly hairless chest. He had an AK-47 aimed at her forehead. He frowned and spoke so quietly she could barely hear. "You're pretty jumpy, Connor." The Terminator's finger was closing around the trigger of his weapon, but John put a hand on his arm, shaking his head no. The cyborg hesitated and watched, learning. Enrique Salceda's fierce features broke into a broad grin. The assault gun dropped to his side as he walked towards Sarah, throwing his arms around her neck and pulling her into a tight embrace. When he stepped back to look at her, they were both smiling. Salceda spoke in slurred Spanish, but Sarah could understand. "It's good to see you, Connor. I knew you'd make it back here, sooner or later." He waved at John, switching back to heavily accented English. "Oye, Big John, ¿qué pasa? Who's your very large friend?" John answered in very natural Spanish. "He's okay, Enrique. This is my uncle, Bob." He turned to the Terminator and said in English, "Uncle Bob, this is Enrique." The Terminator tried a smile. It still needed a lot of work. Salceda squinted at him, glanced at Sarah. Uncle Bob, huh? Okay." Then he shouted towards one of the trailers. "Yolanda, get out here. We got company. And bring some fucking tequila." A thin Guatemalan youth named Franco, only 18 or so, came out of the trailer with a MAC-10, followed by Salceda's plump, wrinkled but cheerful, wife, Yolanda. 3 younger children trailed after her like ducks. Juanita, a pretty 12-year-old, Jamie, a grinning 8-year-old, and Paco, a 2-year-old baby boy, Yolanda waved at John and shouted greetings in Spanish. The Terminator looked down at John and quietly said, "Uncle Bob?" "So, Sarita," Salceda said. "You're getting famous, you know that? All over the goddamn TV." He ripped the cap off the tequila bottle and offered her a drink. She upended the bottle and took a good couple of healthy swallows, then handed it back to Salceda, without expression. Her eyes didn't even water. Paco toddled over to the Terminator and grabbed his pants, sliming them with drool. The cyborg looked down at the tiny kid, fascinated. He hadn't seen such small humans before. He rapid scanned his memory for data on infants. There was little there. As the others talked, the Terminator reached down for the child and picked it up with one huge hand, turning it to different angles, recording the physical data. The child seemed not to mind, gazing somberly into the cyborg's impassive face. The Terminator set Paco down. The child waddled off, a little dizzy, and bumped into his father. Salceda picked him up and handed him to his wife. "Honey, take Pacolito. Thanks, baby." Salcedo took the bottle back from Sarah and guzzled half the contents. Then he turned to Uncle Bob and held out the tequila. "Drink?" The Terminator said, "No, thank you." Salceda turned back to Sarah. "How long you staying?" "I just came for my stuff. I need clothes, food, and one of your trucks." "Hey, how about the fillings out of my fucking teeth while you're at it?" Salceda growled, but he was grinning when he said it. "Now, Enrique." She gave him a charming smile, one he couldn't resist. Not that there had ever been anything between these two but mutual respect and trust. Although Yolanda was no longer any man's idea of beauty, she was the mother of his children, and still wonderful in bed. And Salceda knew very well that if he ever tried anything with Sarah, the Americano woman would probably slice off his balls and feed them to his chickens. She'd almost done as much to one of his younger cousins the last time she'd been in camp. Sarah turned to the Terminator and her son. "You two are on weapons detail." "Oh, Mom," John started to say. "March," Sarah commanded. "Come on," John said to the Terminator, and walked towards an aging and rusted caterpillar sitting behind one of the trailers. John climbed into the driver's seat and expertly backed it towards the Terminator, who was standing nearby, holding one end of a piece of heavy chain that disappeared into the sand. "Hook it on!" John shouted, and shifted into forward. But when he looked back, the Terminator was already yanking the chain hand over hand, pulling up a huge metal plate buried under 6 inches of hot sand. "Cool," John said, and hopped off the tractor, approaching the rectangular hole in the ground. The Terminator joined him, and he looked down at what seemed like the mouth of a tomb. "One thing about my mom," John said, "she always plans ahead." First John, then the Terminator, jumped down into the hole. Sunlight slashed down into a cinder block room, less than 6 feet wide, but over 20 feet long. Sand spilled down the sides of the walls, which were lined with guns of almost every variety. There were rifles, pistols, rocket launchers, mortars, RPGs, radio gear. At the far end, boxes containing ammo, grenades, and rockets were stacked to the ceiling. Here was a room the Terminator had no trouble comprehending. The man-machine scanned it, deciding where to begin. The Terminator picked up a Vietnam-era blopper, an M79 grenade launcher. It was a very crude but effective weapon. He opened the breech and inspected the bore. It had been fired a few times. "Excellent." "Yeah, I thought you'd like this place," John said, smiling sadly. Sarah emerged from a trailer, wearing boots, black fatigue pants, t-shirt, aviator shades. Now her outward form reflected her inner one. She was all caught up to speed. She'd had food and was now among the few people on the planet she could trust. Not only was she regrouped and resupplied, she was beginning to get ready for a counter-attack against the blind forces of Skynet and fate itself. Which was not to say she was not still terrified. Her son was still a target of something that made the Terminator seem ineffectual, something she had never imagined possible. But she had been getting used to the impossible lately. Locked in an insane asylum, one thinks of all sorts of impossible things. Now that she was out and the T-1000 had made its appearance, she was going to see if some of those impossibilities could be one she manufactured. Salcedo was nearby, packing food and other survival equipment with Yolanda. He looked up as Sarah approached, slapping the side of a big 4x4 Bronco next to him. "This is the best vehicle I've got. But the starter motor is blown. You got time to change it out?" "Yeah, I'm gonna wait till dark to cross the border." She gently steered him out of Yolanda's earshot, not wanting to worry her with what she was about to say to Salcedo. "Enrique, it's dangerous for you here. You need to get out tonight, okay?" He narrowed his eyes at her, almost as if she had insulted him, then revealed a gold-capped tooth in a cockeyed grin. "Yeah, Sarita, sure. Just drop by any time and totally fuck up my life." She clapped him on the shoulder. "I'm sorry, don't," he answered. "I know the drill. You do the same for me." He turned back to the packing. Sarah watched him for a moment, working alongside his wife, and thought about the human race. The evil men and women who fumbled desperately for themselves in the continuing crisis of their lives, ruthlessly elbowing aside anyone remotely in their way. And then there were the sheep, those who had no lives of their own, who unconsciously willed themselves over to the others, or were easily tricked into giving up their most precious commodity, in defending the takers even unto their own deaths. And then there were the Salcedos. Men and women who made their own rules. Modern gypsies who refused to be cowed by the material seductions of city and state. They formed small bands, enlarged families, and moved across the landscape untouched by the authorities, because they were armed and dangerous if fucked with. They demanded nothing from anyone, took nothing from anyone, and sometimes gave just for the hell of it. Men like Salcedo helped Sarah decide during one of the darker periods in her life that humanity was worth saving after all. There was a time when all she could think of was hiding John from the world, keeping down, letting it all happen in a place where they could survive the machine war, and live in a hole somewhere at the bottom of the world, living what was left of their lives on the edge of global oblivion. Let mankind wind down. Hell, maybe it was natural selection anyway. Darwin mechanized into an efficient killing machine that mowed down its original creators. She'd seen a lot of evil in those days. People who tried to exploit her, despite the fact she had an infant son. People who were blind to how low they had fallen into the abyss. People who knew and were more dangerous for knowing because they would do anything to be able to crawl back out or drag others back in. There was one night where she prayed, yes, actually prayed to a god she wasn't sure existed, to put an end to all of it. And when her prayers were not answered, she sat up all night holding the pistol, feeling its cold comfort, thinking of ending the world for just herself and John. But that she could not do. Then the bastards of the earth would have really won. She came away from that night harder than she had ever been before, her love for John sealed into an Iron Maiden of commitment. He would not die, and the machines would be defeated, and Kyle's death would have meaning. But still, she could not care that much for the fate of mankind. She had lost the ability to care for people beyond herself and John, until Salcedo found her and nursed her back to humanity within the bosom of his family. And now Sarah screamed out in the night against the utter horror of nuclear annihilation, because it was Salcedo's children she saw dying in the radioactive fires. Yes, if ever in history there was a time for impossibilities, this was it. Down in the weapons pit, John was selecting rifles from a long rack. The Terminator returned from carrying out several cases of ammo. John continued his train of thought, as if uninterrupted. See, I grew up in places like this, so I just thought it was how people lived. Riding around in helicopters, learning how to blow shit up. John grabbed an AK-47 and racked the bolt as if a humanoid extension of the gun, inspecting the receiver for wear. Some subtle wrongness in it made him put it back. His movements were efficient, professional, disinterested. The Terminator was listening to John, as no human could. Every tonal nuance factored into the world for added meaning. Not one moment passed over, every syllable recorded for later restudy, if necessary. Then, when Mom got busted, I got put in a regular school. The other kids were like, into Nintendo. Games. John thought about how, up until recently, he had thought it had all been a game. As he stood surrounded by this arsenal of death, he realized how close he and his mother had come to death. Are you ever afraid? John impulsively asked the cyborg. The Terminator paused a second. Afraid. The thought never occurred to him. He dutifully searched his mind for the answer. No. Fear was a detriment to total mission commitment, and yet, around the edges of that pre-programmed fact, a tiny insight sparked. Humans had fear because they were mortal. And yet, in spite of, or even because of this fear, they would sometimes sacrifice their lives for another useless emotion to the Terminator. Love. It was an interesting paradigm. The Terminator siphoned part of his mind off to contemplate it while he slung the M79 and started looking for the grenades. Not even of dying. No hesitation in the answer. No. You don't feel anything about it, one way or the other? The Terminator gave the automatic answer, although it was still processing through the paradigm. I have to stay functional until my mission is complete. Then it doesn't matter. John idly spun a Sig Sauer 9mm pistol on his finger, backwards and forwards like Bat Masterson. Yeah, I have to stay functional too. Then, in a sing-song mimicry of his mom, I'm too important. The litany of his life. And he was pouring his heart out to a walking death machine about it. That was the pitiful part, John thought to himself. He often did that, thought to himself. He had never really had any real friends, except here with Salcedo's family. Back in the world, what could he say to guys his own age? He had tried several times to tell people things. They gave him the strangest looks. John remembered Tim. That was the closest he had come to a real friend. But he was really just someone to unconsciously share the loneliness with, a chum to hang out with. Even Tim had given him that look when he had mentioned his crazy mother. No, to John Connor, the world was a cold place, even in the warm spots. And here, among the guns and the dirt, talking to a machine from the future, he actually felt listened to. Was the Terminator a friend? He had saved his life several times in the last 24 hours. He gave advice. He took it. He didn't make a lot of stupid mistakes. Yeah, John thought, maybe it's silly, but the Terminator was a friend. A synthetic man who, by default, when measured against his mother's relentless drive, was actually a pretty nice guy. The Terminator pulled back a canvas tarp, revealing a squat, heavy weapon with 6 barrels clustered to a blunt cylinder. A GE minigun. Rate of fire was 6,000 rounds per minute. 7.62mm shells on a linked belt feed from an ammo canister nearby. The most fearsome anti-personnel weapon of the Vietnam era. The Terminator stuffed the ammo canister into a nylon bag and hefted the heavy gun. John nodded gravely and said, "It's definitely you." Sarah had their weapons and supply selections laid out on 2 battered picnic tables for cleaning and packing. Maps, radios, documents, explosives, detonators. Just the basics. The next time the T-1000 came crawling, they'd be ready. She was field stripping and cleaning guns, very methodically. Absolutely no wasted motion. Not far away, John and the Terminator were working on the Bronco, greasy up to their elbows, lying on their backs under the engine compartment, ratcheting bolts into place on the new water pump. John was saying, "There was this one guy that was kinda cool. He taught me engines. Mom screwed it up, of course. Sooner or later she'd always tell them about Judgment Day and about me being this world leader and all that, and that'd be all she wrote." A part of the Terminator's brain was overlaying John's words and behaviour into a surprisingly complex matrix. The cyborg came to the conclusion that John was missing something important in his life, an element essential to survival for a human being. More processing was required to fit what it was into the basic facts. The Terminator continued working on the vehicle, a simple reassembly of basic units that required a fraction of his mental capabilities. "Torque wrench, please. Here. I wish I could have met my real dad." "You will." "Yeah, I guess so. My mom says when I'm old, I send him back through time to 1984. But right now, he hasn't even been born yet. It messes with your head." "Hand me that bolt," the Terminator requested, quite comfortable with the concept of time loops and alternate reality. As John handed it to him, he continued, "Mom and him were only together for one night, but she still loves him, I guess. I see her crying sometimes. She denies it totally, of course, like she says she got something in her eye." They crawled out from under the station wagon into the bright sunlight. "Why do you cry?" the Terminator asked, realizing that was part of the complex matrix. "You mean people?" "I don't know. We just cry, when it hurts." "Pain causes it." No, it's different. It's when there's nothing wrong with you, but you hurt anyway. You get it?" The cyborg lost the flow of the concept. "No." John shrugged. "You have to kind of feel it to understand it, I guess." "I guess," the Terminator added, as he got into the Bronco and turned the ignition key. The engine caught with a roar. "All right, my man," John yelled, slapping the cyborg's open palm. "No problemo," the Terminator said, around a crooked smile. John grinned and did a victorious thumbs up. The Terminator imitated the gesture, awkwardly, not certain of its relevance. John laughed and made him get out of the Bronco and try the move again. Across the compound, Sarah paused in her work to watch John and the Terminator. She was too far away to hear them, only to see the pantomime as John showed some other gestures to the cyborg. Trying to get him to walk more casually, John walked. Then the Terminator tried it. Then John gestured wildly, talking very fast, explaining the fundamental principles of cool. They tried it again. This time, the hulking man swung his hips as John did. As Sarah watched John with the man machine, she realized that she had found a solution to the one chink in the plan that she had been formulating. The Terminator would never stop protecting John. It would never leave him. It would live out John's lifetime for that purpose only. And it would never hurt him, never shout at him, or get drunk and hit him, or say it couldn't spend time with him because it was too busy. And it would die to protect him. Of all the would-be fathers who came and went over the years, this machine, this thing, was the only one who measured up. In an insane world, it was the sanest choice. Sarah clenched her jaw and went grimly back to work. A strong woman burnished into iron by years of hard choices.